Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to be joined by my partner, my colleague, the Speaker of the Assembly, Karen Bass, as well as the two excellent budget chairs from each of our houses, Senator Denise Ducheney and Assemblymember Noreen Evans. I want to begin with a positive note. The governor's call to be relentless to go after more federal investment is the right call. So that's something positive. With regard to the bulk of the budget proposal, I have one reaction. You've got to be kidding. Our job is to hasten the recovery of California's economy. Before we even consider making the lives of children, working families, the elderly, and others more difficult, before we cut anything that harms our economic recovery, the management needs to get its house in order. And what do I mean by that? The governor has rightfully talked about the number one priority being job creation in California. And let's look what's happening within the administration. There's an estimated $20 billion of federal stimulus money collecting dust in the bureaucracy that needs to get to the street. We need to take that money, get it out the door, have the states do its job, and put people back to work. Earlier this week, Inspector General Laura Chick reported that there is a 60-day and growing backlog in the Office of Historical Preservation to get money out the door to create high-wage jobs. And I bet that's just the beginning. The administration said they're going to deal with the backlog. The Inspector General tells us they've been saying that for 2 months. We have billions of dollars of already approved bond funds for projects that have the greatest potential to create jobs in California. Where are the changes necessary to get that money out? The governor talked about furloughs and about state employees. And he often talks, and others talk, about running the state like a business. You want to run the state like a business, you sit down and you talk to your employees about where to gain the cost savings. The governor refuses to do so. And we are not, as a legislature, going to contravene the law that's been in existence for decades in this state and make unilateral wage cuts without the governor sitting down and talking to the employees. And why does it matter? When the governor acted unilaterally to impose 3 days of furloughs, the Franchise Tax Board has told us that between February 2009 and June 2010, they will not collect $652 million worth of taxes, while they save $60 million worth of salaries. Now, I do the math here. That's $600 million that could be avoided right off the top in cuts to health and human services. Our economic recovery will not be hastened if we cut education. And despite sort of the maneuver and the shells moving back and forth over the little ball, in fact, when you read the governor's budget, he calls for cutting education $2.4 billion. Real cuts that the schools expected. And while the actual level of investment is the same, we know that the cost to the schools are going way up. We also know that they are proposing making it easier to expedite the layoffs of teachers. What does that mean? Harder for the economy to recover and more pain for people. The governor's transportation swap proposal is another example. Bottom line, it's reduced investment in transportation infrastructure at the very time we need to increase our investment in transportation. The governor says he is fighting for California. And you know, I believe him. The one thing I always say about the governor, and of course I like him personally, is that he loves this state. But I think it's a fair question to ask. Who are you fighting for? And what are you fighting for? Certainly not the people who have already made great sacrifices who are being asked to make more sacrifices. You'll ask the question, are there alternatives? Of course there are. I talk at every press event I can about the administration and minority parties' refusal to consider applying the same withholding rules to businesses that we apply to working people. And you know what the Franchise Tax Board has told us applying a 3% withholding for contractors would do for California? $2 billion, one time, and ongoing savings because we'd be addressing the underground economy. But $2 billion. This is a matter of choices, folks. And we're not going to go down that same road where we talk about limited options. The one other thing I think you should be aware of, and then I'll turn it over to the speaker, is that unlike last year, where in both February and July, the failure to make cuts in a timely way would have resulted, in fact, did result in a cash crisis and in IOUs for taxpayers and others. I'm pleased to know that our cash situation is pretty good. So we'll sit down with the governor right away. We'll work every day for the next 2 weeks, but we intend to take a different approach. Speaker Bass?
Thank you. Well, I would like to join my partner, Senator Steinberg, in saying that a good note from the governor's presentation was his call for more federal funds. However, I do want to say that the way he is approaching the federal government, I would certainly approach differently. I think if you look at his essential message, it's that if we don't get $8 billion from the federal government, then we are going to make these draconian cuts. To me, what this amounts to is the governor shifting his tactic. Typically, he threatens the legislature. Now he's threatening the President of the United States. I have difficulty with that. In his State of the State, he didn't mention it today, but in his State of the State, he called on our congressional delegation to vote against health care reform. And this is a governor who a few years ago was leading the charge in the nation through fighting for health care reform in the state of California. I don't think it's a good way to start off the new year by approaching our congressional delegation in that manner and the administration. You know from the beginning that we have always talked about, and I do like the fact that he is making some of the same calls that we have been making for years, which is we need to get more return on our dollar. For every dollar that we send in, we get 78 cents back. I like hearing him saying that. And I also like hearing him saying that we need to look at the formulas. But I do think that we need to approach the federal government from a point of collaboration and not threats. Ironically, the other day on the Assembly floor and in the Senate, we passed Race to the Top legislation, and we heard the governor call for education reform, and in particular looking at the lowest achieving schools and making sure that those kids are not trapped in those schools, and that's why we passed Race to the Top. I think that it is a huge conflict and contradiction to say that we care about those kids from 8 to 3. But once they get out of those schools, we don't necessarily care whether they have food, whether they have shelter, whether their parents are employed, or whether they're on the street. We have to look at the safety net in its entirety. We support education reform. We want that additional money from the federal government for Race to the Top, but we can't dismantle parts of the safety net that also apply to the same kids that we're talking about in Race to the Top. I have to say that I will be interested in looking in detail at some of his proposals. I do believe that he is slipping policy issues in there that really amount to his concern over his legacy. When we are talking about fund shifts and revenues, we are talking about those on a temporary basis. When we are looking at cuts, those cuts would be in place permanently. We do know that there are several areas that the governor would like to change. He mentioned in his State of the State, didn't mention today so much, but absolutely apply to the budget. He talked about changes in CEQA. He talked about changes in lawsuits. He talked about combating fraud. He talked about pensions. He talked about repealing public-private partnerships when they come to education. I happen to believe that this is a part of him fighting for his legacy. I think it's a conservative agenda. I do not believe that we should take advantage of the budget crisis to move areas of public policy that ordinarily would not survive the legislative process. So having said all of that, the governor did say that he is somewhat in denial that this is his last year in office. It is also my last year in office. I'm not in denial about that. But when I do look at his budget proposals, they seem to be a big pile of denial. Thank you very much.
Good line. I just want to say one other piece I didn't talk about was, to show to show the lack of creativity. The governor goes right back to Prop 10 and Prop 63. And as I remember, we tried that last year, and the voters said no. We would be willing, however, to consider putting Prop 49 back on the ballot, the after school. It really is to go back to the ballot at all. I think the voters told us pretty clearly solve the problem without doing that.
Speaker Bass, the governor is proposing practically eliminating the CalWORks Healthy Family, a very important program for Democrats. What would be your counter proposal?
Well, I think that there's a lot of different things that we need to look at. One thing that he mentioned in his State of the State, not so much today, is about reform. And one of the things that you will find coming out of both houses of the legislature on a bipartisan basis will be a series of reforms. I do think that that's something we absolutely need to look at. I don't think there's any way, anyhow, you can talk about eliminating health care to children in a time in our nation when we're talking about expanding health care. When it comes to CalWORks, again, I'm talking about the kids that we're concerned about from 8 to 3, but don't care if they eat afterwards.
How precarious is it to store money in the budget that relies on action by the federal government and the Congress? $7 billion. How are we going to get that money?
It's not the first time.
We proposed it actually the last time, but we proposed it in the context of knowing that there was going to be the economic recovery package. So we had a basis in which to score it the last time. This time, I think it's wishful thinking.
Are there specific revenue-generating proposals?
Well, I certainly just talked about one, the independent contractor withholding issue. Again, we believe we can hasten the economic recovery if we focus more on management than coming right out of the box with more damage that will hurt people and harm the economic recovery. How is it that $20 billion sits in the state coffers when we have a 12-point plus unemployment rate in this state? Look, in the end, I do think there's a fundamental question of fairness here. The governor once proposed an oil severance tax. The governor once proposed a tobacco tax. The governor has proposed some very industry-specific measures that would raise revenue. We'd certainly be open to revisiting those proposals, but how can you be for that 1 year, go through what we have gone through, and then come back on top of the cuts we have already made and propose another $8.5 billion worth of cuts and the potential elimination of essential investments and services for people?
So you alluded to this earlier. You're going to be pushing for some of those taxes. You said you're not going to go down the same road of having no outcomes. Is that what you have in mind?
Well, I could tell you where we're going to start. First of all, recognize very important point. There's a difference between January and July. And last year we faced a terrible cash crisis that compelled us to resolve the entire budget in February. That would be nice to do again, but not like this. And so what I'm saying to you is that the first thing we are going to do with the leadership of our budget chairs and our members is we're going to address how we can stimulate this economy fast. and how we can find alternatives within the bureaucracy other than much of what's been proposed. We're realists. We know in the end, when it comes to July, that these numbers are large, and that we're going to have to make hard decisions. But this isn't the way to start.
You talked about the oil severance tax and different oil issues in this proposal, linking the Tranquion Ridge proposal with state parks funding. Can you, Madam Speaker or Senator? Or
Well, I mean, I will just say, right. I will just say that it didn't make it out of the Assembly before. It is possible to be reconsidered again. Maybe some of the environmental issues have been resolved, but I would be doubtful that that would make it through again. But let me just address the other question. You will find that fighting for taxes is not going to be the centerpiece on how we're going to respond to this budget. But given that we are facing another record deficit, we have to say that all of the tools will be on the table, and we're not going to take anything off of the table.
Senator Steinberg, can I follow up on the $20 billion that's backlog? I talked to the department that supposedly oversees the Office of Historic Preservation.
Like a one-guy shop.
Go through, the State Park Department is saying that it's the feds that actually oversee that department.
Sounds like it's the week to blame the feds here. What we know is that Laura Chick, who was hired specifically as the Inspector General, put out a letter this week in which she described a 60-day backlog to get billions of dollars out the door. And it seems to me that before we engage in the complicated and the divisive, we ought to start with the basics here. And we ought to do what we can with the resources we have to improve this economy. And this is, I'm sure, the tip of the iceberg.
In terms of social services, we talked last year about all the impacts, those cuts we're going to have. So what is the additional, if these new cuts that he's proposing were made, whether the ones he's actually proposing or eliminating those programs, how much does it compound the damage that's already been done?
This is a recycled budget, okay? These are exactly the same proposals he made last year. We talked about them. We rejected them. We did as much as we thought we could do. And we rejected the ones and he's come back to the same ones that he had before. It's not, these aren't new. The cut to IHSS here is the same 90% of the people under this new proposal, or the same 90% of the people who would not have gotten services under the proposal he made last year. CalWORKs grant reduction, has been around the block. There were CalWORKs changes, and I think we go back to Senator Steinberg's point that, everything, we had a hearing yesterday on prisons, because prison reform is huge, and the cost of prisons and all of that is huge. And we all agree that the prisons should not be costing what they are. But, he left a settlement on the table last year. He had Kate negotiate a settlement with Kelso that the court accepted, that they were prepared to pitch to the court, and they pulled back. I've never understood why they pulled back on that settlement, but they had a settlement that would have resolved a lot of these health care issues at a lower cost. He rejected his own settlement. I don't understand that. It's the partnerships that are missing. The employees will come to you and tell you how you could save money in there, but they won't talk to them and negotiate with them in good faith, as all businesses are asked to do with their employees. Ask General Motors how they got their savings and kept alive. How did Ford stay alive? They negotiated with their employees to figure out how to make the savings. This governor has refused to do that. And today he even said to you all, no, I don't want to talk to them. I'll just talk to the legislature. Well, that's not what we're here for. They are the management. They are the administration. The reason the SHPO can't do their work is because there aren't enough people there, and the few people he has are on furloughs. And we tried to make that point to the administration last year. Some of these furloughs cost more than they save. The furloughing of BOE employees who collect taxes is not helpful. The math doesn't work, as Senator Steinberg pointed out. You lose more money than you gain. And the same thing is true in the prisons. The same thing is true federal dollars that we are leaving on the table because the governor's insisted on furloughing employees who are paid with federal dollars to provide federal benefit checks in unemployment insurance and disability insurance and all of those areas. Those are federally funded employees. So not only is their pay paid by the federal government that we're losing, and that therefore those families aren't paying their taxes, and it's why Sacramento has one of the highest foreclosure rates in the state, even as the rest of the state starts to recover, because those employees aren't able to pay their mortgages. and it's federal dollars that they're leaving on the table. So they refuse to differentiate between the different jobs and different employees. If you furlough, as the governor has proposed, and he says he's avoiding layoffs, but we had 800 teachers in the prisons who are being laid off this month. And they came to us yesterday in a hearing, and they said, you know, what we do saves money, because if we do literacy, if we do vocational training for prisoners, which is what he says he wants to do, and under the reforms that we passed last year is important, you're not saving money by laying those people off, because in the end, you then have the recidivism, and you're going to have your caseload back up in the prisons, and you're not going to save the money that you expected from the reform. So what this budget mostly says is we weren't able to do the things we told you we could do, is management at Medi-Cal, in prisons, and in places. And therefore, we're going to now blame the federal government. We're going to blame the courts. We're going to blame everybody else. They need to look inside and figure out how to manage the state first. And that will be the focus of our first couple of rounds of hearings. We're going to start hearings on this budget next Thursday. And, we got to get their house in order first, and then we'll see what the gap is that we have to talk about any kinds of cuts or increases.
Yeah.
The prison settlement that the governor backed out of. Yeah, he backed out of that, but he did support a prisoner reduction plan that was going to get us a large way there. But we got a very watered-down version of that in the end for the assembly. So what do you see doing it? What way do you see the legislature able to trim spending out of corrections without reducing, say, education and rehab programs?
Well, the legislature got about halfway there last year, and there certainly is more work to do. But the essence of the overcrowding lawsuit that is now still pending appeal, still costing the state hundreds of thousands of dollars to litigate, the essence of that is to reduce the population. And the governor has the administrative authority to settle that case. You asked the question, it was absolutely correct. He has the administrative authority to settle the case. And to settle the case and to settle the medical case with the receiver would bring us more than the savings he calls for in this budget. It's another case of management. And this is order of priority. Senator Cheney, I thought, put it very, very well. Let's look at what the gap is after we get the House in order. That hasn't happened.
Senator Steinberg, so just to be clear, are you looking at closing the current fiscal year gap instead of taking all 18 months at once?
It would be nice to close it all at once, but certainly during the Prop 58 session, we are going to endeavor to probably work off the legislative analyst's report. My view, it's $5 to $6 billion, and they make a number of recommendations about how we collect what was promised and how to realize some of the savings that the administration said we could realize when we closed the budget in July, and focus right there.
Well, no, it is a non-starter, because what that, we are definitely going to try to see what resources we can get from the federal government. I can tell you the list is a non-starter because, just as Senator Duke Cheney said, it is the same list from last year. It's calling for the virtual elimination of the safety net. California would be the only state in the country. I made the mistake last year of saying that would make us similar to Mississippi. Didn't mean to insult folks from Mississippi, but it actually would have made us worse. So, it is a non-starter to say that we would ever consider the virtual elimination of the safety net in the state of California.
At the time when you rejected that list, you did not have the $20 billion deficit that you have now. I mean, Senator Cheney is saying you had a different one, but now you have another one.
We were worse last year.
Right, but now you have made those cuts and you have another $20 billion deficit. So even if you go back and find some other things, you're not going to, with efficiencies, close $20 billion. So, I mean, it seems likely there are probably, in one way or another, going to have to be, if you don't raise taxes, other cuts. And going back to
I didn't say there wouldn't be cuts.
what would be the impact of new cuts on top of the cuts that you already had before?
They would be
You know, you can go down the street to Lowe's.
Except elimination. That's
You
all.
eliminate CalWorks, you're increasing homelessness. You eliminate in-home supportive services. You're not only probably people won't live as long, but you're also going to increase state costs for nursing homes. I mean, there's a whole. There have been endless credible reports and studies about the impact on the economy and the impact of people of continuing down this road.
I would encourage you to go down the street to Lowe's and Fish's and ask them how their population has changed, because you can go down there and they will tell you how there has been a dramatic increase in women and children to Lowe's and Fish's, the homeless center in the Sacramento area.
Later on this month, the Assembly Budget Committee is holding a hearing on what I would term to be the body count from the last series of cuts, and we'll have a lot more specific information at that point. In addition to which, this afternoon we'll have, my budget staff will have available for you a written analysis of the governor's proposal that he made this morning, and I've been blogging on a couple of times a week on various aspects of his proposal.
Last question.
Including
Karen, the governor several times has talked about making K-12 education whole. I'm interested in your perception. Do you see his budget as making K-12 education?
No, his education doesn't make K through 12 whole. And as a matter of fact, what is the cut? Is it
$2.4 billion is
I
what
think
his own budget.
I think it's the way he has packaged it, but I think the essence of it is a cut. Thank you.